Well, hello everybody. I'm sorry about that last video. Not very long. I had to sleep soon. It's only 7:42. So yeah, I'm reading you chapter 7, Death of Salesman. And I know we can't finish off the book. It's another 170 pages. 180 pages. No, 190 pages. So yeah, right, let's read it. Chapter 7, Death of a Salesman. They had a late breakfast at a cafe in Bayside Marketplace, right on the quayside, with boats moored all around them, and bright yellow and green water taxis nipping back and forth. Tom Turner and Belinda Troy had knocked on Alex's door at 10 o'clock that morning. In fact, Alex had been awake for several hours. He had fallen asleep fast, slept heavily, and woken too early. The classic pattern of transatlantic jet lag. But at least he had had plenty of time to read through the papers that Joe Biden had given him. He now knew everything about his new identity, the best friends he had ever met, the pet dog he had never seen, even the high school grades he had never achieved. And now he was sitting with his new mother and father, watching the tourists on the boardwalk strolling in and out of the pretty white-fronted bow queues that cluttered the area. The sun was already high, the glare coming off the water almost blinding. Alex slipped on a pair of Ray-Ban aviator sunglasses and the world on the other side of the G15 polarized lenses became softer and more manageable. The glasses hadn't been present from Jack. He hadn't expected to need them so soon. There was a book of matches on the table with the word Snackyard printed over on it. Alex picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. The matches were warm. He was surprised the sun hadn't set them alight. A waiter in black and white, complete with bow tie, came over to take the order. Alex glanced at the menu. He had never thought it would be possible to have so much choice for breakfast. At the next table, a man was eating his way through a stack of pancakes with bacon, hash browns, and scrambled egg. I like pancakes. I like hash browns. Nope, I don't like scrambled eggs, but I love bacon too. Alex was hungry, but the sight took away his own appetite. I'll just have some orange juice and toast, he said. Wholemeal or granary? Granary with butter and jam. You mean jelly? Troy paused until the waiter had gone. No American kid asked for jam, she said. You asked for that at Santiago Airport and we'll be in jail or worse before you can blink. I wasn't thinking, Alice began. You don't think you get us killed? Worse, you get us killed. She shook her head. I still say this is a bad idea. How's Lucky? Turner asked. Alex's head spun. What was he talking about? And then he remembered. Lucky, the Labrador that the Gardner family was supposed to have back in Los Angeles. He's fine, Alex said. He's being looked after by Miss Beach. She was the woman who lived next door. But Turner wasn't impressed. Not fast enough, he said. If you have to think about it, the enemy will know you're telling a lie. You have to talk about your dog and your neighbours as if you've known them all your life. It wasn't fair, of course. Turner and Troy hadn't prepared him. He hadn't realised the test had already begun. In fact, this was the third time Alex had gone undercover with a new identity. He had been Felix Lester when he had been sent to Cornwall, and Alex Fred, the son of a multi-millionaire in the French Alps. Both times he had managed to play the part successfully, and he knew that he could do it again now, as Alex Gardner. So how long have you been with the CIA? Alex asked. That's classified information, Turner replied. He saw the look on Alex's face and softened. All my life, he said. I was in the Marines. It's what I always do. Even when I was a kid, younger than you. I wanted to die for my country. That's my dream. We shouldn't be talking about ourselves. We shouldn't be talking about ourselves, Belinda said angrily. We're meant to be a family, so let's talk about the family. All right, Mom, Alex muttered. They asked him a few more questions about Los Angeles while they waited for the food to arrive. Alex answered on autopilot. He watched a couple of teenagers go past on skateboards and wished he could join them. That was what a 14-year-old should be doing in the Miami sunshine, not playing spy games with two sour-faced adults who had already decided they weren't going to give him a chance. The food came. Turner and Troy had both ordered fruit salad and cappuccino decaffeinated with skimmed milk. Alex's guests, they were watching their weight. His own toast came with grape jelly. The butter was whipped and white seemed to disappear when it was spread. So, who was the salesman? Alex asked. You don't need to know that, Turner replied. Alex decided he'd had enough. He put down his knife. All right, he said. You've made it pretty clear that you don't want to work with me. Well, that's fine, because I don't want to work with you. With you either. And for what it's worth, nobody ever will believe you or my parents, because my parents would ever behave like you two. Alex, Troy began. Forget it. I'm going back to London and if you're Mr. Brian asked why, you can tell him I didn't like the jelly, so I went home to get some jam. He stood up. Troy was on her feet. At the same time, Alex glanced at Turner. He was looking uncertain too. He guessed that they would have been glad to see the back of him, but at the same time they were afraid of their boss. Sit down, Alex. She shrugged. Troy shrugged. Troy said. She shrugged. Okay, we are out of the line. We didn't mean to give you a hard time. Alex met her eyes. He slowly sat down again. It's just going to take us a bit of time. It's just going to take us a bit of time to get used to the situation. Troy went on. Turner and me, we've worked together before, but we don't know you. Turner nodded. You get killed? How's that going to make us feel? I was told there wasn't going to be any danger, Alex asked. Alex said, anyway, I can look after myself. I don't believe that. Alex opened his mouth to speak and stopped himself. There was no point with arguing with these people. They'd already made up their minds, and anyway, they were the sort who were always right. He'd met teachers just like them, but at least he'd achieved something now. The two special agents had decided to loosen up. You want to know something about the salesman? Troy began. He's a crook. He's based here in Miami. He's a nasty piece of work. He's Mexican, Turner added. From Mexico City. So what does he do? He does just what his name says. He sells things. Drugs, weapons, false identities, information. Troy ticked off the list on her fingers. If you need something and it's against the law, the salesman will supply it. At a price, of course. I thought you were investigating Sarov. We are. Turner hesitated. The salesman may have sold something to Sarov. That's the connection. What did he sell? We don't know for sure. Turner was looking increasingly nervous. We just know that 2 of the salesman agents flew into Skeleton Key. They flew recently, but they didn't fly out again. We've been trying to find out what Sarah was buying. What's all this got to do with the Russian president? Alex still wasn't sure he was being told the truth. We don't know that until we know what it was that Sarah bought, Troy said, as if explaining something to a 6-year-old. I've been working undercover with the salesman for a while now, Turner went on. I'm buying drugs, $500,000 worth of cocaine being flown in from Colombia. At least that's what he thinks, Turner smiled. We have a pretty good relationship. He trusts me, and today just happens to be the salesman's birthday. So he invited me to go for a drink on his boat. Alex looked across the sea. Which one is it? That one. Turner pointed at a boat moored at the end of a jetty. About 50 meters away. Alex drew his breath. It was one of the most beautiful boats he had ever seen. Not sleek, white, or fiberglass. Like so many of the cruisers he had seen moored around Miami. Not even modern. She was called Mayfair Lady and was an Edwardian classic motor yacht, 80 years old, like something out of a black and white film. The boat was about 120 feet long, with a single funnel rising over its centre. The main saloon was at deck right level, just behind the bridge. A sweeping line of 15 or more portholes suggested cabins and dining rooms below. The boat was creamed with natural wood framings, a wooden deck, and brass lamps under the canopies. A tall, slender mast rose up at the front with the radar. The boat's one visible connection with the 21st century. Mayfair Lady didn't belong in Miami. She belonged in a museum, and everybody that came near her was somehow ugly by comparison. It's a nice job, Ali said. The salesman must be doing well. The salesman should be in jail, Troy muttered. She had seen the admiring look in Alex's eyes and didn't approve. And one day, that's where we're going to put him. 30 years of his life, Turner agreed. Troy dug her spoon into her fruit salad. All right, Alex, she said. Let's start again. You're a maths teacher. What's her name? Alex looked around. Her name is Miss Hazeldine. And nice try, but we learn maths in England. Americans learn maths. Troy nodded, but she didn't smile. You're getting there, she said. They finished their breakfast. The CIA agents tested out for a few more details. They lapsed into silence. They didn't ask him about his life in England, his friends, or how he had stumbled into the world of MI6. I didn't see it, so they didn't seem to want to know anything about him. The skateboarders had stopped playing, and Turner looked at his watch. Time to go, he muttered. I'll stay with the kid, Troy said. I shouldn't be more than 20 minutes. Turner stood up, then slapped his hand against his head. Hell, I didn't get the salesman a birthday present. He won't mind, Troy said. Tell him you forgot. You don't think he'll be upset? It's okay, Turner. Invite him out for lunch another time. He'll like that. Turner smiled. Good idea. Good luck, Alex said. Turner got up and left. As he walked away, Alex noticed a man in bright Hawaiian shirt and white trousers coming from the opposite direction. It was impossible to see the man's face because he was wearing sunglasses and a straw hat, but he must have been involved in some sort of terrible accident. His legs were dragging awkwardly, and there seemed to be no life in his arms. For a moment he was right next to Turner on the boardwalk. Turner didn't notice him. Then, moving surprisingly quickly, he had gone. Alex and Troy watched as Turner walked all the way along to Mayfair Lady. There was a ramp at the end of the jetty leading up to deck level. It allowed the crew to wheel supplies on board. A couple of men were just finishing as Turner arrived. He spoke to them. One of them pointed in the direction of the saloon cabin. Turner went up the ramp and disappeared on board. "What happens now?" Alex asked. "We wait." For about 15 minutes, nothing happened. Alex tried to talk to Troy, but her attention was fixed on the boat, and she said nothing. He wondered about the relationship between the two agents. They obviously knew each other well, and Byron had told him they worked together before. Neither of them showed their emotions, but he wondered if their friendship might be more than professional. Then Alex saw Troy sit up in her seat. He followed her eyes, coming back to the boat. Smoke was coming out of the funnel. The engines had started up. The two crewmen Turner had spoken to were on the jetty. One of them untied the boat, then climbed on board. The other ones walked off. Slowly, Mayfair Lady began to move away from her mooring. "Something's gone wrong," Troy whispered. She wasn't talking to Alex. She was talking to herself. "What do you mean?" Her head snapped round as she remembered he was there. It was a 10-minute meeting. Tom wasn't meant to be going anywhere. Tom. It was the first time she had used his first name. Maybe he changed his mind, Alex suggested. Maybe the salesman invited him on a cruise. He wouldn't have gone, not without me, not without cover. It's against company procedure. Then, his cover's been blown! Troy's face was suddenly pale. They must have found out he's an agent. They're taking him out to sea with them. She was sitting up now, but not moving, paralyzed with indecision. The boat was still moving gracefully, already a full half of its length, was projecting out beyond the jetty. Even if she ran forward, she would never reach it in time. "What are you going to do?" Alex asked. "I don't know." "Are they going to? If they know who he is, they'll kill him." She snapped the words as if it was somehow Alex's fault, as if it was a stupid question that he should have never asked. And maybe it was this that decided him. Suddenly, before he even knew what he was doing, he was on his feet and running. He was angry. He was going to show them that he was more than a dumb English kid that they obviously thought he was. "Alex!" Troy called out. He ignored her. He had already reached the boardwalk. The two teenagers he had seen earlier were sitting in the sun finishing their drinks. I didn't see him snatch one of their skateboards and jump onto it. It was only as he pushed off, propelling himself over the wooden surface towards the departing boat, that one of them shouted in his direction, but by then it was too late. Alex was balanced perfectly. Snowboards, skateboards, surfboards, they were all the same to him, and this skateboard was a beauty. A Flex-Dex downhill racer with ABEC 5 racing bearings and cryptonic wheels. Typical of Miami's kids to buy only the best. He shifted his weight suddenly, aware that he had neither a helmet nor knee pads. If he came off now, he was going to be hurt. It was going to hurt, but that was the least of his worries. The boat was pulling away. Even as Alex watched, the stern with its churning propeller slid past the end of the jetty. Now the boat was out to sea. He could see the name Mayfair Lady dwindling as they moved into the distance. In seconds they would be too far away to reach. Alex hit the ramp that Mint had been using to load and unload the boat. He soared upwards, and suddenly he was in mid-air, flying. He felt the skateboard fall away from his feet. He heard it splash into the sea, but his own momentum carried him forward. He wasn't going to make it. The boat was moving too fast. Alex was plunging down, following a knock that was going to miss the stern by centimetres. It would bring him down. It would bring him crashing down into the water. And then what? Propellers? They would slice him to pieces. Alex stretched out his arms, and somehow his scrambling fingers made contact with the rail that curved round the black back of the boat. His body smashed into the metal stern, his feet dipping into the water above the propellers. He felt the breath punch out of him. Somebody on the boat must have heard, but he couldn't really rather know. Now, he would just have to hope that the noise of the engines had covered the collision. Using all his strength, he pulled himself up and over the rail, and then finally he was on deck, sword to the knees. His entire body was aching from the impact, but he was on board, and miraculously he hadn't been seen. He crashed down, taking stock of his surroundings. The stern deck was a small, semi-enclosed area shaped like a horseshoe. In front of him was a saloon cabin with a single window facing back, and the door a little further down the side. There was a stack of supplies underneath the tarpaulin, and also 2 large cans. Alex unscrewed one of the lids and sniffed it. It was full of petrol. The salesman obviously planned to be away for some time. The entire deck, both port and starboard, was overshaded by a canopy hanging down on either side of the main saloon. There was a wooden lifeboard suspended on 2 pulleys above his head, resting briefly against the stern rail. As he was safe provided, nobody actually walked to the back of the boat. How many crew members would there be? Presumably there was a captain at the wheel. He might have someone with him. Looking up, Alex glimpsed a pair of feet crossing the upper deck of the roof and the saloon. That made 3. There could be 2 or 3 inside. 3 more inside, 6 perhaps in total. He looked back. The porter of Miami was already slipping away behind him. Alex got up and slipped off his shoes and socks. Then he crept forward, moving absolutely silently, still nervous about being spotted from the upper deck. The first 2 windows of the saloon were closed, but the third was open, and crouching below it, he heard a voice. A man was talking. He had a thick Mexican accent, and every time he spoke the letter S, he whistled softly. "You are a foolish man. Your name is Tom Turner. You work for the CIA, and I am going to kill you." Another man spoke briefly. "You're wrong. I don't know what you're talking about." Alex recognized Turner's voice. He got left, and right then, with his shoulders against the cabin wall, he levered himself upwards until his head reached the level of the window, and he could look in. A saloon cabin was rectangular, with a wooden floor, partly covered by a carpet that had been rolled back, presumably to avoid blood stains. Unlike the boat, the furniture was modern, office-like. There wasn't a great deal of it. Turner was sitting in a chair with his hands behind his back. I could see that some sort of parcel tape had been used to tie his arms and legs. He had already been beaten. His fair hair was damp, and blood trickled out of the corner of his mouth. There were 2 men in the cabin with him. One was a deckhand in jeans and black t-shirt, his stomach bulging out of his belt. The other man had to be the salesman. He was a round-faced man with very black hair and a small moustache. He was wearing a 3-piece wide suit, immaculately tailored, and brightly polished leather shoes. The deckhand was holding a gun, a large, heavy automatic. The salesman was sitting in a cane chair, holding a glass of red wine. He rolled it in front of his nose, enjoying the aroma, and then sipped. "What a delicious wine," This is Shilleen, a carbonate soaring grown on my own estate. You see, my friend, I'm successful. I have business all over the world. People want to drink wine. I sell wine. People want to take drugs. They are mad, but that is no concern of mine. I sell drugs. What is so wrong with that? I sell anything that anyone wishes to buy, but you see, I'm a careful man, but I did not buy your story. I made certain inquiries. The Central International Agency is mentioned, and that is why you find yourself here. What do you want to know? Turner rasped. I want to know when we are 1 hour out of Miami, because that is when I intend to shoot you and dump you over the side. The salesman smiled. That is all. Alex sank down again. There was no point listening to him anymore. He couldn't go into the cabin. There were 2 of them, and only one of him. And although he had a weapon, it wouldn't be enough, not against a gun. He needed a diversion. Then he remembered the petrol. Glancing quickly at the upper deck, he prepared to go back to the stern, then froze as the door of the bridge opened and a man came out. There was nothing I could do, nowhere he could hide, but he was lucky. The man dressed in a faded uniform of ship's captain had been smoking a cigarette. He stopped long enough to throw the butt into the sea, then went back the way he had come without turning his head. It had been a close escape, and Alex knew it had only been a matter of time before he was noticed. He had to move fast. He ran on tiptoe to the petrol cans. He tried tilting one of them, but it was too heavy. He looked around for a rag, couldn't find one, and so took off his shirt, ripping it apart in his hand. Quickly he pushed the sleeve into the can, soaking it in petrol. Then he pulled it out, leaving only the end still dangling inside. A makeshift fuse. What would happen when he set fire to the petrol? And guessed that the explosion would be enough to attract the attention of everyone on board, but not strong enough to kill anyone or sink the boat. Since he was still going to be on board, he would just have to hope he was right. He reached in his pocket and took out a book of matches that he had been playing within the restaurant, cupping his hands to protect the flame from the breeze. He lit first one match, then the whole book. He touched the flame against the rag that had once been his shirt. The whole thing was alight in a second. Running forward again, he returned to the saloon cabin. He could hear the salesman still speaking inside. Another glass, I think. Yes, but then I'm afraid I must leave you. I have work to do. Alex looked in. The salesman was standing at a table, pouring himself a second glass of wine. As Alex looked back over his shoulder, there was no one there. Nothing had happened. Why hadn't the petrol caught fire? Had the wind blown out his makeshift fuse? And then it exploded. A great mushroom of flame and black smoke leaped into the air. At the back of the boat, snatched away instantly by the wind. Somebody shouted. Alex saw that the petrol had splashed all over both decks. There was fire everywhere. The canopy right above his head was alight. Whatever had been packed underneath the tarpaulin was also blazing. More shouting footsteps started towards the third deck. Now was the time to move. See what is happening? Alex heard the salesman snap the command, and a second later the deckhand came racing out. He disappeared around the other side of the cabin. That just left the salesman himself. That's his thing on his own with Turner. Alex waited a few seconds, then stepped into the doorway once again, reaching into his trouser pocket. Turner saw him before the salesman. His eyes widened. The salesman turned. Alex saw that he had put down his glass and picked up a gun. For a moment, neither of them moved. The salesman was looking at a 14-year-old boy, barefooted and naked from the waist up. It obviously hadn't occurred to him that Alex could be any threat to him, that it was the boy who had set fire to his boat. In that moment of hesitation, Alex made his move. When he brought his hand up, he was holding a mobile phone. He only dialed 2 lines before he got it. He pressed the button for the third time as he aimed it for the phone. "It's for you," he said. He felt the phone shadow in his hand as a tiny needle came shooting out of the headphone. Port silent and invisible. The salesman had reacted fast, already bringing his gun round, but suddenly he stopped and slapped a hand to his neck. A second later, as if he had been stung by a wasp. A second later, his eyes rolled and he slumped to the floor. Alex jumped over him, picked up a knife from the table and went over to Turner. What the hell? What the hell? The CIA man began. Alex could see at once that he wasn't badly hurt. At the same time, his mood didn't seem to have improved. He looked from the phone to the uncushioned figure of the salesman. What did you do to him? He asked. He got the wrong number, Alex said. He cut through the adhesive tape. Turner got to his feet and snatched up the gun that salesman had dropped. He checked the clip. The gun was fully loaded. What happened? He demanded. I heard that was an explosion. Yeah, that was me. I set the boat alight. What? I set fire to the boat. But we were on the boat. I know. But before Alex could say any more, Turner moved, twisting around and snapping into combat position, arms up, legs apart. There was a stairwell at the far end of the cabin. Alex hadn't noticed it before. A figure had appeared coming up from below. Turner fired twice. The figure crumbled back down. Turner stopped. Black smoke was seeping into the cabin. The second explosion, the entire boat rocked as if seized by a sudden squall. There was shouting outside the deck, looking out of the window. Alex could see flames. That must have been the second petrol tank, he said. How many tanks are there? Just 2. Turner seemed almost dazed. He forced himself to a decision. The sea, he said. We're going to have to swim. The CIA agent went first, edging sideways out of the cabin. Suddenly the deck was full of people. There were at least 7 of them. Alex wondered where they had come from. 2 of them, young men in dirty white shirts and jeans, were fighting the flames with extinguishers. There were 2 on the roof, another on the deck. All of them were shouting. Smoke was trailing into the sky. Behind the boat, the lifeboat was ablaze. Part of the canopy was on fire. At least, nobody knew quite what had happened. Nobody had seen Alex come on board. The explosion had taken them all by surprise, and all they cared about was getting the fire under control. However, as Turner came out of the cabin, one of the men of the upper deck saw him. He called out in Spanish. Move! Turner shouted. He ran for the edge of the boat. Alex followed. There was a deafening shatter of a machine gun, and what was left of the canopy above his head was torn to shreds. Bullets smashed into the deck, sending chips of wood flying. A glass bulb exploded. Alex wasn't even sure he was fine. All he knew that he was trapped in the middle of smoke and flames and bullets, and a lot of men who wanted him dead. He saw Turner dive over the side. There was another burst from the machine gun. Alex felt the deck rip itself apart centimeters from his bare feet. He held out, splinters stabbed into his ankle and heels. He spurted forward and threw himself over the handrail. For what felt like an eternity, everything was chaos. And he felt the wind racing over his bare shoulders. There were no more gunshots. Then he plunged headfirst into the Atlantic and disappeared beneath the surface. Alex allowed the ocean to embrace him. After the battlefield that Mayfair lady had become, his water was warm and soothing. He swam down a powerful breaststroke that took him even deeper. Something whizzed past him, and he realized that he was still being shot at. The further down he went, the safer he would be. He opened his eyes. The salt water stung, but he needed to know how far he was going. He looked up. Light glimmered at the surface, but there was no sign of the boat. His lungs were beginning to hurt. He needed to breathe, but still he waited. He would have been happy if he could stay underwater for an hour. He couldn't, with his body crying out for oxygen. Alex kicked reckoning for the surface. He came up gasping with water streaming down his face. Turner was next to him. The CIA agent looked more dead than alive. Alex wondered if he had been hit, but there was no sign of any blood. Perhaps he was in shock. Are you all right? Alex asked. Are you crazy? Turner was so angry that he actually swallowed water as he spoke. He spluttered and fought him to keep himself from going under. You could have gotten us killed. I just saved your life. Alex was getting angry himself. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. You think so? Look! With a sense of dread, Alex swiveled round in the water. The Mayfair lady hadn't been destroyed. The fire was out and the boat was coming back. He had been under water for perhaps 90 seconds. In that time, the ship had continued forward with all hands fighting the flames, and nobody at the wheel. The engine had been at full throttle, and it was now about 500 meters away, where the captain obviously returned to the bridge. The boat was reeling round. I could make out 4 or 5 men standing at the bow. All of them were armed. They had seen him. One of them pointed and shouted. He and Turner were helpless, floating in the water with perhaps one weapon between them. Soon the boat would reach them. They were sitting targets to be picked off like ducks in a fair. What could he do? He looked at Turner, hoping the old man would produce something, some rabbit out of a hat. Don't CIA have gadgets? Where was the inflatable speedboat or the concealed aqualung? But Turner was helpless. He'd even managed to lose the gun. Mayfair lady completed her turn. Turner swore. The boat drew closer, slicing through the water, and then it exploded. At the time, the explosions were huge. Finally, there were 3 of them. Simulations in the bow, the middle and the stern. Mayfair lady were quite separate. Mayfair lady was blown into 3 quite separate pieces. In the funnel and main saloon, heaving themselves out of the ocean as if trying to escape from the rest of the boat. Alex felt the shockwave travel through the water. The blast was deafening. A fist of water smashed into him, almost knocking him out. Pieces of wood, some of them on fire, rained down all around. He knew at once that nobody could have survived, and with that knowledge came a terrible thought. Was it his fault? Had he killed them all? Turner must have been thinking the same thing. He said nothing. The 2 of them watched as the 3 sections of what had been a classic motor yacht sank and disappeared. There was the sound of an outboard motor. Alex twisted around. A speedboat was racing towards them. He saw Belinda Troy at the wheel. She must have somehow commanded it and come after them. She was on her own. She helped turn out of the water first. Then for the first time, Alex realized that he couldn't see land. He felt that it had all happened so quickly, and yet Mayfair lady had managed to put several kilometers between itself and the coast before it destroyed. What happened? Troy asked. The wind had caught her long hair and spread it all around her. She looked as if she was having a hypnotic. I saw the boat blow. I thought you were... She stopped and caught her breath. What happened? She repeated. It was the kid. Turner's voice was neutral. He was still trying to catch up with the events of the last few minutes. He cut me free. You were tied up? Yes, the salesman knew I was with the agency. He was going to kill me. Alex knocked him out. He had some sort of cell phone. He was stating the facts, but there was no gratitude. The boat rocked gently. Nobody moved. He blew up the boat. He killed them all. No, Alex shook his head. The fire was out. You saw. They'd got the boat under control. They were turning around, about to come back. For God's sake! The CIA man was almost too tired to argue. What do you think happened? You just think one of the lights fused and Mayfair lady just happened to blow up. You did it, Alex. You set the gas alight and that's what happened. Gas, steam and petrol. It was one of the words that they had tested him on the snackyard that morning, a century ago. I saved your life. Yeah, thanks, Alex. But Turner's voice was bleak. Troy climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. The speedboat turned as they headed back towards the shore. Chapter 8. Passport Control. Alex had a window near the front of the plane. Troy was next to him with Turner on the other side. Next to this aisle, a family on a holiday, on vacation, he reminded himself. Troy was reading a magazine. Turner had finished the script. He was meant to be producer and had spent the journey making notes in the margin, just in case anyone happened to be looking. Alex was playing with a Nintendo DS. He's wondering about that. Turner had given it to him just before they'd left Miami. It had been very casual, standing in the departure lounge. Here, Alex. Something will keep you busy on the plane. Alex was suspicious. He remembered that the last time he had held a Nintendo DS, it had been filled with gadgets invented by Smith at MI6. But as far as he could tell, this one was completely ordinary. At least he'd got level 5 of Super Mario. And so far it hadn't exploded in his hands. He looked out the window. They had been in the air for about an hour. This had been their second flight of the day. They had gone from Miami to Kingston, Jamaica. Jamaica had caught the second plane there. They had been given the sort of snack that people expect, but never enjoyed on the plane. A sandwich, a small square of cake, and a plastic tub of water. Now the stewardesses returned hastily collecting the trays. This is your captain speaking. Please fasten your seatbelts and return to your seats to the upright position. We will shortly be coming to land. Alex looked out of the window again. The sea was an extraordinary shade of turquoise. It didn't look like water at all. Then the plane dipped, and suddenly he saw the island. Both islands. Cuba itself was to the north. Cayo Esquelette was below it. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and for a moment the land mass was perfectly clear, laid out as if on the surface of the world. Two patches of emerald green with a coastline that seemed to shimmer and an electric blue. The plane tilted, the island disappeared, and the next time Alex saw the plane was coming in low, rushing towards a runway that seemed almost unreachable, hemmed in by offices and hotels and roads and palm trees. There was a control tower, ugly and misshapen, a low-rise terminal, prefabricated concrete and glass. Two more planes already on the ground, surrounded by service trucks. There was a jolt as the back wheels came into contact with the tarmac. They were down. Alex unclipped his seatbelt. Wait a minute, Alex. Troy said. The seatbelt light is still on. She was behaving like a mother, but the sort of mother she had chosen was bossy and demanding. Alex had to admit that it suited her. Anybody watching them might believe they were family, but they would have to add that they were an unhappy one. Since the events in Miami, the two agents had practically ignored him. Alex found it hard to work them out. Turner would be dead if it hadn't been for him. But neither of them would admit it, as if in some way he had attended their professional bride, and they still insisted that he had blown up Mayfair lady, killing everyone on board. Even Alex was finding it hard to avoid a sense of responsibility. It was true that he had set fire to the petrol. What other reason could there have been for the explosion that he had followed? He tried to put it out of his mind. The plane had come to a halt, and everyone had stood up fighting for the overhead lockers in a cramped compartment. As Alex reached up to take his own bag, the Nintendo DS almost fell out of his grip. Tyler's head snapped round. Alex saw a flash of alarm in his eyes. Be careful with that, he said. He was right. There was something hidden inside the Nintendo. It was typical of the CIA agents to keep him in the dark. But that hadn't stopped them asking him to carry it in. It was midday, the worst time to arrive. As they came out of the plane, Alex felt the heat reflecting off the tarmac. It was hard to breathe. The air was heavy and smelled of diesel. He was sweating before he had even reached the bottom of the steps, and arrivals lounge offered no relief. The air conditioner had broken down, and Alex soon found himself trapped in a confined space with 200 or 300 people and no windows. The terminal was more like a large shed than a modern airport building. The walls were a drab olive green, decorated by posters of the island that looked 20 years out of date. The passengers from Alex's flight caught up with passengers still being preceded from the flight below, and the result was a large, shapeless crowd of people and hand luggage shuffling slowly towards three uniformed immigration officials in glass cabins. There were no queues, as each passport was stamped and one more person was allowed in. The crowd simply pressed forward, oozing through the security controls. An hour later, Alex was still there. He was dirty and crumbled, and he had been a raging thirst. He looked to one side where a couple of old, splintered doors led into men's and women's toilets. Men's and women's toilets. There might be a tap inside, but would the water even be drinkable? A guard in a brown shirt and trousers stood watching, leaning against the wall, beside a floor-to-a-ceiling mirror. A machine gun cradled in his arms. Alex wanted to stretch his arms, but he was too hemmed in. There was an old woman with grey hair and sagging face standing right next to him. She smelled of cheap perfume. As he half-turned, he found himself almost embraced by her and recoiled, unable to hide his disgust. He glanced up and saw that there was a single security camera set in the ceiling. He remembered how worried Joe Byron had been about security at San Diego Airport, but it seemed to him that just anyone could have walked in and nobody would have noticed. The guard looked bored and half asleep. The camera was probably out of focus. At last they reached passport controls. The official behind the glass screen was young, with black greasy hair and glasses. Turner slid 3 passports and 3 completed immigration forms through. The official opened them. "Don't fidget, Alex," Troy said. "We'll be through in a minute." "Sure, Mom." The passport looked up at them. His eyes showed no welcome at all. "Mr. Gardner, what is the purpose of your visit?" he demanded. "Vacation," Turner replied. The man's eyes flickered briefly over the passport, and then at the people to whom they belonged. He slid them under a scanner, yawning at the same time. The guard that Alex had noticed was nowhere near. He was gazing out of the window, watching the planes. "Where do you live?" the official asked. "Los Angeles." Turner's face was blank. "I'm in the movie business." "And your wife?" "I don't work," Troy said. The official had come to Alex's passport. He opened it and checked the picture against the boy who was in front of him. "Alex Gardner," he said. "How are you doing?" Alex smiled at him. "This is your first trip to KOS Colette?" "Yeah, but I hope it won't be my last." The passport official stared at him. His eyes magnified the glasses, but he seemed completely uninterested. What hotel are you staying at?" he asked. The Valencia," Turner said quietly. He had already written the name on the 3 immigration forms. Another pause, then the officials picked up a stamp and brought it crashing down 3 times. 3 gunshots in the confirmed space of the kiosk. He handed back the passports. "Enjoy your visit to KOS Colette." Alex and the 2 CIA agents passed through the immigration room and into the luggage hall where the cases were already waiting, circling endlessly on an old, creaking conveyor belt. And that was it, Alex thought. It couldn't have been easier. All that fuss, and he hadn't even been needed in the first place. He picked up his case. At the same time, although he was unaware of it, his picture and passport details were already being transmitted to police headquarters in Havana, Cuba, along with those of Turner and Troy, the family. The family had actually been photographed 3 times. Once by the overhead camera that Alex had seen in the arrival lounge, which was far more sophisticated than he would have believed, as old-fashioned as it looked. But it could zoom in on the whole in a man's button or a single word written in a diary, and blow it up 50 times if needed. They had been photographed a second time by a camera behind the mirror next to the toilets. And finally, a profile close-up shot had been taken by a camera concealed in a brooch worn by an old lady who smelled of cheap perfume and who had not, in fact, arrived on the plane, but who was always there, mingling with the new arrivals, moving in on anyone who arose the suspicions of the people she worked for. The immigration forms that Turner had filled in were also on their way, sealed in a plastic bag. His answers to the standard questions mattered less to the authorities than the forms themselves. The paper had been specially formulated to record fingerprints, and in less than an hour these would be digitally scanned and checked against a huge database in the same police building. The invisible machine that operated in the airport at Santiago had been focused on Turner and Troy before they had even arrived. They were American. They had said they were on vacation, and their luggage, which had of course been searched as it came off the plane, contained the sunscreen, beach towels, and basic medicines that you would expect an ordinary American family to pack. The labels on their clothes showed that they had all been bought in Los Angeles, but a single receipt tucked into the top pocket of one of Turner's t-shirts told another story. He had recently bought a book from a shop in Langley, Virginia. Langley is where the headquarters of CIA are based. The scrap of paper had been enough to set alarm bells ringing. This was the result. The officer in charge of security at the airport was watching them carefully. He was sitting in a small windowless office, and their images were right in front of him on a bank of television screens. He watched them as they continued out of a baggage reclaim and into the arrivals hall. His finger hovered briefly beside a red button on his console. It still wasn't too late. He could pull them back in before they had reached the taxi stand. There were plenty of cells buried deep in the basement, and when the normal questions failed, there were always drugs. And yet the head of security was called Rodriguez, and he was good at his job. He had integrated so many American spies that he sometimes said he could recognize at one at 100 meters. He had spotted Miss Gardner before they had crossed the runway, and had sent out his deputy to take a closer look. This was the bored-looking guy that Alex had seen. This time, Rodriguez wasn't sure, and he couldn't afford to make mistakes. After all, Cayo Escalade needed its tourists. It needed the money the tourism brought. He might have his suspicion about the two adults. There were two adults travelling with a child. He had overheard the brief conversation between Alex and the passport official. There were microphones concealed throughout the image. How old was the boy? 14, 15? Just another American kid being given 2 weeks on the beach. Rodriguez made up his mind. He lifted his hands away from the alarm button. It was better to avoid the bad publicity. He watched the family disappear into the crowd. Even so, the authorities would keep an eye on them. Later that day, just to be on the safe side, he would compile a report which would be sent along with the photographs and fingerprints to the local police in Cayo Escalade. A copy would also be forwarded to the very important gentleman who lived in Casa d'Oro, and perhaps someone who would be sent to the Hotel Valencia to keep a close eye on the new arrivals. Rodriguez settled in his chair and lit a cigarette. Another plane had landed. He leaned forward and began to examine the arriving crowd. The Valencia was one of those amazing hotels that Alex usually saw in dream hotel holiday prizes on the game shows. It was tucked away in a crescent-shaped cove with miniature vials spread out along the beach and a low-rise reception area, almost lost in a miniature jungle of exotic shrubs and flowers. There was a donut-shaped swimming pool with a bar in a ring and stools poking up just above the level of the water. The whole place seemed to be asleep. This was certainly true of the few guests. Alex could see lying motionlessly on the sun lounges. Alex and his parents were sharing a villa with 2 bedrooms. Sharing a villa with 2 bedrooms. With 2 bedrooms and a veranda sheltered from the sun by a sloping straw roof. There was a clump of palm trees, white sand, and the impossible blue of the Caribbean. Alex sat down briefly on his bed. He was covered with a single white sheet, and a fan turned slowly in the ceiling. A brilliant green and yellow bird perched briefly on his windowsill, then flew off towards the sea, as if inviting him. "Can I go for a swim?" he asked. He wouldn't normally have asked their permission, but he figured it probably suited his role. "Sure, honey." Troy was unpacking. She had already warned Alex that he would have to stay in character whenever they were in the villa. The hotel might well be bugged. But you be careful. Alex changed into his shorts and ran across the sand in the sea. The water was perfect, warm, crystal clear. There was no shingle, only softest carpet of sand. Tiny fish swam all around him, scattering instantly when he stretched out his hand. For the first time in his life, Alex was glad he had met Alan Blunt. This was certainly better than hanging out in West London. One thing seemed to be going his way. After he had swum, he climbed into a hammock, stretched out between 2 trees, and relaxed. It was about 4:30, and the afternoon felt as hot as it had been when they arrived. A waiter came up to him, and he asked for a lemonade, charging it to his villa. His mum and dad could pay. "Mum and Dad?" As he swung gently from side to side with water trickling through his hair and drying on his chest, Alex wondered what his real parents would have been like if they hadn't both died in a plane crash soon after he was born. And what it would have been like for him, growing up in an ordinary home with a mother to run to when he was hurt, and a father to play with, to borrow money from, or sometimes to avoid. What would it have made him any different? He would have been an ordinary schoolboy worrying about exams, not spies and salesmen and exploding boats. He might have been a softer person. He probably have had more friends, and he certainly wouldn't have been lying in a hammock in the grounds of the Hotel Valencia. He stayed there until his hair was dry, and he knew it was time to get out of the sun. Turner and Troy hadn't come out to find him, and he suspected they were busy with their own affairs. He was still sure there were a lot of things that they were telling him. You remember the Nintendo DS? They had only mentioned it at the very last minute, just as they were about to get onto the plane. Could it be that they had wanted him to carry it onto the island, knowing that a 14-year-old would have less chance of being searched? Alex rolled out of the hammock and dropped down onto the sand, like a man was walking past, selling strings of beads to the tourists out on the beach. He glanced at Alex and held up a necklace, a dozen different shells on a leather cord. Alex shook his head, then walked the short distance back to his villa. He still had the Nintendo in his hand luggage. Turner had forgotten to ask for it back. Alex slipped quietly into the room, took it out and examined it again. There seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary. It was bright blue with the single game, Super Mario lodged in the back. Alex weighed it in his hands. As far as he could tell, it wasn't heavier or lighter than it should have been. Then he remembered. The Nintendo he had once been given by a mistake had been activated by pressing the start button 3 times. Perhaps this button will work the same way. Alex turned it over and pressed the button. Once, twice, and a third time. Nothing happened. He gazed for a moment at the blank screen, annoyed at himself. He was wrong. It was just a game. given to him to keep him quiet on the plane. It was time to get dressed. He put the Nintendo DS on the bedside table and stood up. The Nintendo squawked. Alex snapped around, recognizing the sound without yet knowing what it was. The Nintendo was still squawking, a strange metallic rattling sound. The screen had suddenly come to life. It was pulsating green and white. What did it mean? He picked the machine up again, and once the noise died away and the lights on the screen faded out, he moved the Nintendo back towards the bedside table. It burst back into life. Alex looked at the bedside table. There was nothing on it apart from an old-fashioned alarm clock supplied by the hotel. He opened the drawer. There was a Bible inside with the text printed in Spanish and English. Nothing else. So what was causing the Nintendo to act in this way? He swung it away. It became silent. He moved it back to the table. It started again. The clock. Alex looked more closely at the dial. The clock had a luminous face. He pressed the Nintendo right up against the glass, and the squawking was suddenly louder than ever. Now Alex understood. The numbers on the clock face were faintly radioactive. That was what the Nintendo was picking up. The Nintendo concealed a GG counter and smiled grimly. Rayman was certainly the right game for this machine, except that the rays it was looking for were radioactive ones. What did it mean? Turner and Troy weren't on the island for a simple surveillance operation. They had been right. Both Blunt in London and Brian in Miami had been lying to him from the very start, and he knew that he was sitting only a few kilometres south of Cuba. He had learned in history came to his mind. Cuba. In the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, nuclear weapons strained on America. He still couldn't be certain. He might be jumping to conclusions, but the fact was that the CIA had smuggled a GG counter in Skeleton Key, and as crazy as it sounded, there could only be one reason why they needed it. They were looking for a nuclear bomb. Right, everyone, that's the end of me reading you. I'd like to say, so bye bye everyone, and thank you so much for listening to this. So go down, click on like and subscribe. So bye bye everyone, and thank you for listening to this. Please subscribe.